And he said, just call 911. I said, what is it? Was somebody shot? He said, yes. And I said, who? And he said, George. They said whoever did this may have been waiting for him, or maybe a gang initiation type thing. He was a really good guy. Everybody loved George.
This is George Young, a devoted husband, a hardworking father, and a man who spent his days protecting others. But one day, the protector became the victim. As he stepped onto his front porch after a long day at work, gunshots shattered the silence, and George collapsed, never to rise again. His murder sent shockwaves through Gwinnett County, but what followed was even more disturbing. What really happened to George Young? Who pulled the trigger, and why? Stick around as we are going to explore the tragic case of George Young. On the night of November 16th, 2017, tragedy struck in Buford, Georgia. It was just past midnight when Tia Young, asleep upstairs in her home, was startled by 2 loud gunshots. Confused and alarmed, she wasn't sure if the noises were fireworks or something more sinister. Her brother, Tim Lee, quickly grabbed his shotgun and stepped outside to investigate. Moments later, he rushed back inside, urging Tia to call 911. Panic set in as she asked him what had happened. When he confirmed that someone had been shot, she asked who it was, and his response shattered her world. George.
And he said, just call 911. I said, what is it? Was somebody shot? He said, yes. And I said, who? And he said, George. They said whoever did this may have been waiting for him, or maybe a gang initiation type thing. He was a really good guy. Everybody loved George.
George Young, a 43-year-old husband and father of 3, lay in a pool of blood on the front porch, his keys still in the lock. He had just returned home from a long day of work providing security for rapper Lil Yachty at a mall in Atlanta. The hard-working family man had spent years ensuring the safety of others as a bodyguard and security system installer. Yet, when it came to his own home, fate played a cruel hand. The security camera above his porch was not functioning, leaving detectives without any immediate footage of the crime. Police arrived at the scene and quickly ruled out robbery as a motive.
Developing this afternoon, the family of a murdered father says he was killed while coming home from working as a bodyguard. Police say someone shot him right on his front porch. Channel 2 Gwinnett County Bureau Chief Tony Thomas live at the home with a project the family says he planned to complete that could have helped solve his own murder. Tony.
Justin, the victim installed security cameras for a living on his house, just right up here under the roof line of the porch. You can see one just feet from where he was shot overnight, but that camera was not working. His family says he was just too busy taking care of his customers to work on his own house. His oldest son said he and his dad had talked about fixing the system just a few days ago. That's a conversation that will likely haunt that young man for a long time.
Because me and him, I talked about fixing one of the cameras that's in front of the house. Like a couple days prior, he asked me to possibly help him with that. And this happened. That's like, wow.
Dylan Young says he can't think of any reason someone would want to kill his 43-year-old father, George.
It's the hardest thing I've ever been through.
George's wife, Tia, says she was asleep upstairs around midnight when she heard 2 gunshots. Her brother went outside.
And he said, just call 911. I said, what is it? Was somebody shot? He said, yes. And I said, who? And he said, George.
The family says they found George in a pool of blood on the front porch, his keys in the lock. Police say they can't find anyone who heard a car, and there's no signs of robbery.
They said whoever did this may have been waiting for him, or maybe a gang initiation type thing.
Young was working a side job Thursday night as a bodyguard for rapper Lil Yachty at Lenox Mall. Police say the job may be unrelated to the crime.
Jokes.
Yeah.
The family prays even though their camera wasn't working, maybe someone else's was, or at least somebody heard something.
He was a really good guy. Everybody loved George.
He says while he worked sometimes in executive protection, he did not carry a gun.
George's belongings, including his wallet and phone, were still on him. There was no sign of a struggle, no reports of a vehicle speeding away, and neighbors hadn't heard anything suspicious leading up to the gunshots. This led investigators to believe that whoever killed George had been waiting for him. Theories swirled, including the possibility of a gang initiation or a targeted attack. When George's sister Ivy received the heartbreaking news, she immediately set out on a 6-hour drive from South Carolina to Georgia, desperate for answers. She contacted Tia for details and was told that police believed George's murder was a case of mistaken identity, possibly related to gang activity. However, Ivy found this explanation hard to believe. George lived in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. Gang-related violence seemed unlikely. As the investigation progressed, police struggled to find anyone with a bad word to say about George. He was described as a kind, hard-working man who went out of his way to help others. Detectives turned their attention to his work, wondering if an incident from his security job had followed him home. However, after interviewing his colleagues, they found no evidence of any altercations that night. Detectives then focused their investigation on those closest to George, his wife Tia and her brother Tim. As they pieced together the timeline, inconsistencies in their statements began to emerge. Investigators also found it suspicious that Tia initially claimed she believed the gunshots were fireworks, yet she still called 911. Why would she react so strongly to something she thought was harmless? Ivy also noticed strange behavior from Tia. After driving all night to be with the family, she expected to find a devastated widow. Instead, she was met with an oddly calm demeanor. When Ivy arrived at George and Tia's home, Tia simply hugged her and said, "Hey," without any visible signs of distress. This was not the reaction Ivy had anticipated from someone who had just lost her husband in such a brutal manner. Even more unsettling was the atmosphere in the house. Ivy observed that no one appeared to be in mourning. It felt as if everyone was carrying on as usual, as if George's murder hadn't just happened on their front porch. She found it particularly strange because she had seen Tia grieve the loss of her own father in the past, crying nonstop. But for George, no tears, no sorrow, just an eerie sense of normalcy. The inconsistencies in Tia's behavior raised further suspicions. As detectives continued their investigation, they discovered a potential motive far more shocking than a random act of violence. The truth about George Young's murder was about to unravel, revealing a web of lies, betrayal, and devastating deception that would shake those closest to him to their core. George's sister knew that Tia didn't have any brothers, and Tim was not a brother. She also stated that when she tried to reach Tia regarding the details of her brother's death, Tim answered Tia's phone, which disturbed her. She questioned who it was answering Tia's phone, and Tim explained to Ivy who he was. He revealed that George had found out that Tim lost his job, so he let him work for his security company. When George discovered that Tim was struggling and living out of motels, he invited him to stay with him, his wife, and their kids. Ivy was familiar with Tim since they had grown up in the same town, but she and her brother George were never close to him. She viewed Tim as quiet and rather odd. Authorities brought both Tim and Tia in for questioning 2 days after the murder. That was when detectives discovered a major revelation. Tim and Tia were not actually related. Tia informed police that Tim was merely a friend of the family looking for a place to live. This revelation was a turning point for investigators, especially when coupled with the fact that their versions of what happened that night kept changing. Then a bombshell came from the Youngs' next-door neighbor. Investigators received a call from him while Tia and Tim were being interviewed. The neighbor reported that he had looked out his window as soon as he heard gunshots that evening and saw someone sprinting from George's Lincoln Navigator, which was parked in the driveway, into the Youngs' house. He believed that person to be Tim. According to the neighbor, the individual took something out of the SUV before running inside. Detectives confronted Tim with this information. When asked if he had gone to the vehicle for any reason, Tim responded, "I was taking the tracker off the vehicle." Tim stated that George had instructed him to install a GPS tracker on his truck so that in the unlikely event something happened to him, the vehicle could still be located. But why was he in such a hurry to remove the tracker if George had really requested it? Tim explained that he was acting on instinct and wanted to protect George. He claimed that he didn't want George's family or friends to know that George had been trafficking weapons from Florida to North Carolina. He also alleged that one of George's associates had come looking for him at their home, telling Tia that George owed him money. However, when police questioned Tia, she had no idea what Tim was talking about. Investigators then turned to George's sister again, and she informed them of a life insurance policy her brother and Tia had. Strangely, Tia had earlier claimed that no such policy existed. She told police she thought all of their life insurance policies had lapsed. However, investigators soon learned that George and Tia actually had a $1 million life insurance policy, and Tia was the sole beneficiary. Even more suspicious, Tia had called to start processing the claim within 24 hours of her husband's murder. Investigators also found it unusual that despite the chaos at the Young household on the night of the murder, the couple's children never woke up. Officers moved in and out of rooms, conducting searches, and loud conversations filled the house. There were medical examiners, firefighters, ambulances, police officers, CSI photographers, and neighbors passing by. Yet the kids remained asleep. The disturbing reason? Tia had given them sleeping pills. Tia and Tim quickly became the main suspects, not only in the eyes of investigators but also in Ivy's. She was convinced they had killed her brother and even told her sister-in-law as much. According to police, Tim had been tracking George's every move that night using a GPS tracker and an app on his phone, meaning only he could have known exactly when George was returning home. Investigators then uncovered a second potential motive beyond the life insurance money. Tia no longer wanted to be with George. Despite what she had told police, her marriage was in trouble. Friends and relatives confirmed this, and her phone contained plenty of incriminating evidence. The messages she exchanged with Tim were not just flirtatious, they were passionate, sexual, and intimate. These were not the types of messages one would send to a so-called brother. By April, as evidence mounted, police brought Tia and Tim back in for interrogation. They immediately confronted them about their relationship, laying out the explicit emails in front of Tia. She admitted to having an affair with Tim, but insisted that they had ended it after the murder. Tim, on the other hand, refused to make any admissions. When asked about his relationship with Tia, he immediately requested a lawyer. That was the final push investigators needed. Both Tia and Tim were arrested and charged with the murder of George Young. Authorities stated that they planned to kill George to collect the life insurance payout and be together. They believe Tia had only been pretending to grieve in her television interviews, playing the part of the devastated widow while secretly scheming with Tim. Both Tim and Tia pleaded not guilty in court. However, the judge denied their bail requests and they remained in jail until their trial. The case quickly gained media attention, particularly because Tia had made emotional television appearances, pleading for justice for her husband.
Once cried in front of television cameras after her husband was killed, and now she is on trial for his murder. George Young was shot and killed on his front porch after coming home from work one night in Gwinnett County. We covered this story extensively. Prosecutors believe his wife and a friend were having an affair and killed him for his $1 million insurance policy. Before she was charged in the crime, we spoke to Tia Young as she pleaded for justice in the case, flanked by her children.
I'm gonna do it by myself. Everybody loved George.
Well, a sharp contrast to that portrayal the prosecution painted in court today. 11 Alive's Latasha Givens was there.
So many people felt for this wife as they watched her cry on television cameras about her husband's murder. But today in court, it was the couple's close friend who says Tia Young and her co-defendant both began acting oddly right after Young's death.
That's hearsay. Judge, I'm going to object. Objection, Your Honor.
This is how the murder trial of George Young began.
He's eliciting hearsay statements.
The defense not holding back on the state's first witness, Young's former boss and friend, Rob Strickland.
He was my go-to guy.
Young's wife, Tia Young, and the couple's live-in friend, Harvey Timothy Lee, are accused of killing him for a $1 million insurance policy. Investigators believe Tia and Lee were having an affair and conspired to murder Young. Strickland's wife and defendant Tia are cousins. Strickland says Tia called them moments after Young was shot. Strickland testified he felt the defendants acted suspiciously when he came to the family's home soon after. He stated while the crime scene tape was still up, Lee talked about sending the children to school the next day, and Tia asked if he would help her find Young's insurance policy. Strickland also testified he noticed the home security camera was not connected. He says that was odd considering George Young worked as a security guard and had his own employees. Thursday afternoon, the prosecution played Tia's 911 call.
I just heard a gunshot.
In the call, she refers to the co-defendant as her brother. And she tells the 911 dispatcher she doesn't want police to come with lights and sirens because she didn't want to wake up her kids.
Okay, they're going to come lights and sirens due to the severity of the issue.
Former crime scene investigator Jordan Drum was called to the stand next. The defense questioned if the crime scene was truly secure, refuting a checklist that may not have included everyone on the scene. And the defense also questioned why a photographer with the show The First 48 was allowed near the crime scene. Then they expressed concerns about the jurors having open lunch around the courthouse where they could potentially hear attorneys talking about the case. That's something Judge Tracy Mason acknowledged and may change when trial resumes tomorrow. In Gwinnett County, I'm Latasha Givens, 11 Alive News.
But now that same woman was on trial for his murder. The trial was intense. One of the state's first witnesses was Rob Strickland, George's former boss and friend, who testified that he found Tia and Tim's behavior suspicious. He recalled that while crime scene tape still surrounded the Youngs' home, Tim was already discussing sending the children to school the next day, and Tia was asking about George's insurance policy. Strickland also noted that the home security cameras were disconnected, which was odd considering George worked in security. A major piece of evidence was Tia's 911 call. In the call, she referred to Tim as her brother and told dispatch she didn't want police arriving with sirens or flashing lights. She didn't want to wake her children. Investigators believed this was because she had drugged them beforehand. On April 6th, the jury returned with a verdict. Tia Young was found guilty of felony murder, aggravated assault, and 2 counts of criminal attempt to tamper with evidence. Tim was convicted of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. The sentencing followed on April 11th. Tim was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tia was sentenced to life plus 3 years but was given the possibility of parole. Make sure to subscribe for more interesting videos like this. Thanks for watching.